Welcome to On Becoming a Healer. Today, we're going to talk about why residents unionize. My co-host, Stefan Kertez, is away, and so it'll just be me and my guest, Dr. Brandon Poplinski. Brandon is an assistant professor at Baylor College of Medicine who attended medical school at the Loma Linda University School of Medicine and obtained an MPH at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. His undergraduate degree is in physics. Brandon served as president of the Resident and Fellows Physicians Union at the University of Washington, Seattle. Welcome, Brandon.
Hi, Saul. Good to be with you.
As those of you who listen to On Becoming a Healer know, Stefan and I take a critical but loving look at our profession. I'm grateful to be a physician, but I believe the profession often eats its young. There are numerous studies showing that medical students and residents report mistreatment and harassment at shockingly high levels, along with burnout and suicidality. A major concern I have is that this shapes the kind of physicians people become. If you're battered, you're more likely to become guarded and closed, distrusting, and unable to engage. And that is going to adversely affect the care that your patients receive. So I thought it would be useful to talk about why residents unionize. While resident unions have been around in small numbers for a long time, they've really been burgeoning recently. In fact, the residents at my own institution are currently organizing. There's a fair amount of debate and some research on what resident unions can or can't change. We won't be able to do justice to such a complex topic today. However, I got interested in hearing the perspective of someone who recently served in a leadership role, in this case as union president, while in training. I connected with Brandon by way of one of the residents at my own institution who described him as especially thoughtful. So, Brandon, before we talk about unions, I'd love to hear about how you got from majoring in physics to entering medical school.
Sure. I knew that I loved science. As you mentioned, I studied physics in undergraduate. I thought I was going to do engineering. I think I was searching for a deeper purpose in my work and career, which obviously is a luxury for people to pursue a lot of the time. But I started thinking maybe biomedical engineering. And I traveled and spent 6 months living in Latin America and was exposed to a lot of social issues that I hadn't been exposed to in my bubble in suburban Minnesota growing up. And I had a lot of time to kind of reflect on, I was in college, a young adult, and thinking about my future in life. And I started to think that maybe I wanted my career and my work to have more of a human and a social aspect to it, still being somebody who loved science. And I thought maybe medical school, maybe being a physician would be something that could meet and merge these interests. I'd gotten accepted to a graduate program, a fully funded graduate program, which was enormous for me. It was such a dream. And at the same time, I was thinking about maybe I need to go to medical school. I applied to a job as a medical scribe and showed up for my first shift in like a semi-rural hospital emergency department in Minnesota. And within the first hour, training as a medical scribe, I knew I wanted to go to medical school. And within a few weeks, I think I kind of rescinded or turned down my graduate school offer. And I just went out on a limb. I hadn't done pre-med, no idea what the MCAT was or how to study for it. I was about to graduate college. I think those 2 years going from that point to getting into medical school and starting medical school were still, in terms of just hours per week of work I was putting in, are still, I would routinely sleep 5 hours a night for like weeks and weeks and weeks on end. Residency, you do that sometimes, but I just found this whole new purpose and interest and kind of a vocation. I think I had found my vocation at that point. So that was my journey to going into medical school.
Now, it's often said that during medical training, medical students become disillusioned, that they start out full of fervor and excitement, and that by the time they're fourth-year medical students, things have started to change for them, that they've become somewhat disillusioned. And then during internship, there's a period of excitement, and then people become increasingly disillusioned. I'm sort of curious about how you would describe your own trajectory. Do you feel like there was a process of disillusionment for you, both during the medical school training process and then subsequently during the residency training process? I'm thinking there must have been some during the latter because you decided at some point to get involved in trying to make changes.
I think I follow that pattern fairly well. Pretty quick, especially into the clinical years of medical school. The disillusionment, I think, comes fairly fast for, I think, many people, if not most, and certainly for me as well. I think that mistreatment and abuse is one part of the whole conversation of our profession and our training process in unions. I remember the very first time, it was after my first year of medical school, and we were dipping our toes in the clinical environment. And I was so excited. And we went to go round at 5:30 in the morning on some patients. That gives you a hint about what kind of specialty maybe this was. But my third year resident, or he coached me on how to present, and I was so ready, and I had learned a bunch, and I started presenting the patient, and I didn't get through half a sentence when the attending literally screamed at me. And it was such a bewildering moment. I don't think at that moment I felt bad about myself, or, I knew it was wildly inappropriate, but I almost wanted to laugh about in what world is this an appropriate way to behave, talk to somebody, particularly talk to somebody you're supposed to be mentoring, training, educating, all that stuff. And then the moments just continue to come and come and come and come, and then you just get used to them, and they're normalized. But that's one early moment, I think, that comes to memory that started to provide disillusionment about how physicians are doing and how they're treating one another, I suppose, if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, when you were a resident, tell me about what types of experiences you had that made you start to think that you wanted to get actively engaged in the union at your institution.
I already knew there were many things about training, residency training specifically, that, in my view, needed significant reform, and that was not an easy thing, and that residents in general were not well. I was, bracing myself and aware of a lot of those things, even without having lived it already myself. And so I was already being conscious about ways in which to contribute to that conversation and to that process of improving things. I was on the lookout for ways to, participate in that. And I remember that the union was starting to talk with the employer about how negotiations were going to ensue, the rules for negotiations. And historically, all of negotiations in the past at my institution and at other institutions have started after daytime clinic hours, for the purpose being that residents who come to advocate for themselves and participate in bargaining, they didn't want to sacrifice their clinical training, their clinical hours, their time with their patients, because that was what was most important to them. And there's a whole conversation about how much we get pulled away from our patients, today compared to years past. And our employer was refusing to honor that priority. That felt very low to me. And that was one thing that pulled me in and made me say, I want to be at the table here with the union board and hear more about what's going on and how this could be happening and why they would do this and what have we said back to them. And that was one thing that tipped me in. But I think the other thing for me personally was that pretty quick into my intern year, I realized that on top of the stress of being an intern, I was also still very, very stressed about paying the bills. And I know there were people coming into residency at my institution in a more difficult financial situation than I was. And so I was already feeling multiple ways that the trainees, the residents and fellows at my institution kind of were deserving to be treated better. And then second of all, once I started, showing up to meetings and talking with folks, I really quick ran into a special group of diverse people who had vision and had energy and had courage and had imagination and were just saying all the things that I had just wished people would say and talk about over the past several years already by the time I was an intern. Those conversations started happening and I was just in. I was like, this is an environment, this is a structure where people are actually working on a tangible way to start battling or grappling with this system that just doesn't respond. It felt empowering. It felt inspiring. It felt like it was a way to make a difference. So that's what got me involved in the union work at the University of Washington.
So can you perhaps give me some examples of the kinds of things that you and your fellow residents who were involved in the union were able to raise with the powers that be, whether it was GME or others, that could genuinely improve the sense of morale and well-being of all of you?
At the time we started those that round of negotiations, we were still one of the few institutions in the country where trainees had 3 weeks of vacation time in a year. And I think my analysis, I looked at like 100 institutions personally. I looked up all the websites, and there were like, it was like 75% or 80% had 4 weeks or more of vacation time in a year. So we got from 3 weeks to 4 weeks of vacation. That was huge for a lot of people. We achieved modest increases in salary. It was not nearly enough for cost of living in Seattle and how fast cost of living continues to increase in Seattle and places like Seattle, but we got modest increases in salary. We got increases, again, far too modest, but in housing stipend. We achieved a totally fully subsidized transportation pass for public transportation in Seattle. We negotiated a policy that pregnant residents or fellows could not be compelled to work 24 hours straight. I think we improved the Safe Ride Home program, but those were a number of things that I think were definitely wins for us in that contract.
And when you think about the factors that lead to resident burnout, I think those are some of them, the ones that you were able to address. But earlier we talked about just the mistreatment that residents sometimes experience and medical students experience. Obviously, now we're talking about residents because it's the union, but talked to disrespectfully, the experience of being dumped on, asked to do a lot that perhaps is kind of not a useful, valuable educational part of your time. The kinds of things that residents feel kind of degrades them or wears them down. To what extent does participation in the union seem to respond to those? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, there are already policies everywhere that say you cannot mistreat, abuse, verbally abuse, be sexist, racist, homophobic towards people. Those policies are already everywhere, but it still happens at incredible rates, which we know. I think that what you gain from having a union is another avenue of support and another resource that you are sure is on your side and has your best interests in mind and will levy every single policy that there is in place to protect you and support you and have your back and create a safe space for you to talk about things, decide when and how to bring things to light. The job of the union leaders, the union staffers, the lawyers that unions employ are to know about every single protection and policy that is in place and how to apply those things to any situation. Especially when I became president, I think once a week, maybe on average, I personally spoke to a trainee, you name any program, department, training program, who had faced some mistreatment and the whole gambit of things. And oftentimes they just wanted to like a safe space to just share, to just say what happened and hear about what the options could be about how to remediate it, and to hear, there's Weingarten rights as well, where if somebody gets called into a meeting and they think it might be disciplinary, you have a right to have a union representative there with you just to be at your side and to be in the room and participate in the conversation and be a fly on the wall. That's another benefit. But you just have someone else in your corner that the union ends up being very powerful in a lot of situations. There would be times where, a resident might say, I booked this vacation, I used my vacation days, and at the last second, my program told me I had to be working at this hour, and it was a clear violation. It was a theft of vacation. You only have 21 vacation days in a whole year, and you're working, you might be a resident working in 80-hour weeks on end, and then your one time where you're supposed to go relax and recover, your flight gets ruined because you have to change your flight and you have to come back and work. And residents, most of the time, they might gripe with their co-residents about it, but they don't even know how to go about. That's such an egregious violation, right? Just that example, having a vacation day stolen from you as a resident. But there's in a resident's mind, oftentimes, because of the way I think that we are, I don't know if indoctrinated is the right word, but acclimated, I guess, to how to respond to that daily kind of thing. You just don't have, you wouldn't even dare email your program a lot of the time to say, what? This is my vacation day. many people wouldn't do that. And that's sad and it's wild. But just to go to the union and say, well, we can provide all these reasons why this is wrong and how this is a violation and yada, yada, yada. And we can say we've had this happen with other residents in the past and we did this and they got their vacation day back. And the union, you negotiate with the person, you discuss how they want to proceed because you never want to put somebody in a position they don't feel comfortable with because there's a lot of fear that happens. But we might end up sending a simple email from the union saying, we have heard that this has happened. This is a clear violation of the contract and of this policy. We expect to hear about how this will be remedied by this date. Please let us know. Thank you so much. 24 hours later, the problem's fixed. And a resident all of a sudden just feels like, we felt it so great to be able to help someone in a situation like that. That's just one little example. But the residents too would feel like amazed that had happened, that there was a safe way for them to have a wrong fixed. So, that's one little example, but there's an infinite number of ways where the union can support folks and to help, create space and discussion about how to support them and fix individual situations and individual moments and incidents, but also to start talking about on a bigger organizational or systems or cultural level, how to start changing that. Sometimes it's because we fixed one moment and then programs or departments or administrators start to realize, oh, people are not going to really tolerate this anymore. Other times you start talking about, hey, what can we do about this known culture of toxicity in this one place or from this one person? And how can we go about in an organized way, in a unified way, to show that we're not going to accept this or tolerate this anymore because it's harming so many of us and our colleagues, month in and month out.
Yeah, when I look at what I've learned from you and from what I've seen about unions, and I want to mention one study that I'm sure you've seen, which was it was a national survey of the effect of unions on surgical residents, and it was published in JAMA Open Access in 2021. Mm-hmm. And there were limitations to the survey. It was given at the end of a long exam that residents had to take where they were tired out and distracted. And then all of a sudden they had to do this survey. It was after the training exam. And that particular study showed that some of the gains that you described were achieved, actually, vacation, things like that, but that it didn't have a self-reported benefit in terms of overall burnout of residents, suicidality, some of the things that obviously we're all very, very concerned about. And, I think one can argue about the methodology and so on and so forth. But when I kind of just look at it from my own subjective perspective, the sense I get is that unions really do help. Obviously, the things that you talked about, the gains that you described, are real, they're meaningful, and they're important. And yet, many ways in which residency adversely affects the psychology of residents are so extensive in terms of the culture and the workload, the environment, some of the experiences of abuse, the incredible amount of time spent just doing tedious documentation. Obviously, on top of that, we layer the effects of the COVID pandemic, which forced residents to often provide a lot of services that were kind of outside of their educational objectives. Obviously, the tremendous personal risk that some of them had to take. The list goes on and on. That there's only so much unions can do. And so I'm sort of left with this sense that unions are absolutely of value, and yet the problem is so much bigger.
Right.
And I'm just sort of curious about your thoughts about that and the extent to which unions kind of hit a limit in terms of what they can do, which, by the way, is not to say anything negative about them, but just to sort of put them in a broader perspective.
Yeah. I think that unions are not an immediate panacea to fix all problems. And it's important to, when you're organizing and when you are recruiting people, when you are encouraging people, when you are trying to convince them about how the union can help them and help us and help future generations of trainees, you have to talk about how it is a process and it's a difficult and drawn out and prolonged process to make progress with unions. You achieve a lot of material benefits pretty quick, oftentimes. The other things, I talk a lot about how thinking about what unions do and what they can do. The union is the members of the union. The union is the residents. The union is not a group of 20 board members who are the union leaders who go and bargain and send emails to hold people accountable and answer your phone calls and show up with coffee. The union is the members, and the union can achieve what the members want to achieve together. And that means that requires organizing. That requires getting people to buy in and believe and participate. There's no magic trick or law or policy for a group of union leaders to exploit. The members are and what they believe in and what they want to achieve. That is truly the limit. I say this a lot. We are limited by our imagination and our courage. And so I listed some things that can be achieved fairly quickly with a union, and those things are huge, don't get me wrong. But it takes a lot of organizing and slow buy-in to get those first steps done. And then when you win some of those battles, little battles and then bigger battles, then people start to believe. Little by little, these battles build your momentum and build your membership to start dreaming a bit bigger, to start thinking about okay, what next? What else do we think is unacceptable? What else is contributing to all of this harm, all of this moral injury, all of this depression, burnout? Can we go after these things in our work environment? Can we make other demands that maybe you can't put in a contract, but you still have a voice, you still have power to make impact on these other higher level things? For myself, and I think many others, the long hours matter. The mistreatment matters. The tasks that are not educational matter, but systemic-wide problems and injustices that affect other people in the healthcare system and most importantly affect our patients and communities that we're taking care of, those things have come to contribute for me and for I think many people far more to my burnout and moral injury and distress. And so in 3 years, I had never dreamed that I would be participating in that kind of real tangible work. We advocated for policies and funding and endorsed candidates who we thought would advocate for things that were meaningful to our members. And so it's those types of secondary and tertiary level advocacy work and change that also really, those issues really impact our well-being and our burnout for many, many people. I'm not saying for everybody, but there's just, you start to realize how many different ways you can make a difference. And you make that difference by being unified in this collective group that has power with a unified voice, that has leverage all of a sudden. During COVID, there was a group of incarcerated folks. They weren't in a jail or a prison anymore. They're being held in some other housing situation. And the COVID rates were through the roof at this place. And the legal situation was such that there was a very obvious case to make that we should just release these people. And we got to get involved with that type of thing. Those were our patients at Harborview Medical Center, and those were our neighbors and people in our community. And we had a voice to contribute to that.
So it sounds like the union has a special value for those of you who are actively involved with it because you have this feeling of empowerment through your advocacy. I would imagine it's a relatively small proportion of residents who are directly involved in the union. Most are probably just paying dues and are occasional beneficiaries. So just tell me a little bit about what proportion of residents are actually involved in union organizing. And I'm thinking that while it takes a lot of time, there's a special boost that you get psychologically from that level of engagement.
Absolutely. It is a very small number. There were 1,400 residents and fellows represented at our institution, but we went from a tiny number to we quadrupled probably in size in the number of people actively participating in the board. Then you have department reps. Those are super important roles too. Those are people who keep their ear to the board and to what's going on and what the discussion is, what the actions are, what the issues are, and share it with their circles. And so it disseminates and disperses what's going on. And they're kind of, maybe they don't have time to be a board member, but they really think the work is important and they want to, help further the conversation, the awareness. But then you have many, many, many people who really care and are involved, and sometimes are involved more than the board members have time for. And so, people naturally with training, you have a busy season and you're burnt out yourself. And I would always say as a leader that you have to you have to make sure that it feels empty to say this because this is what we all get told and tell ourselves all the time, to take care of ourselves. But I would never, if somebody said, I just cannot fulfill this obligation or duty right now, people have to take care of their own, you have to prioritize going through your training to become a physician and staying sane and well. And then whatever you have left over with your waxing and waning of your responsibilities and your energy and your, come, join, participate. But we would never ask somebody to overextend themselves for union work. But so much of it just overflowed naturally from people. Also, additionally, through people who were interviewing and matching to different programs, they were inspired and they're like, I want to be here in that environment. So many people felt like it was a great way to do the type of work that maybe they hadn't even imagined was possible, until they found out about unions.
Do you think that your experience and the experience of your colleagues with the union changed the way in which you interacted with patients? So did it affect your mindset in some way, your frame of mind in some way, so that when you walked in to see a patient, that you somehow were a better physician as a result?
That is a great question. That's hard to answer, I think. If we're not well, we cannot be the physicians we want to be. Participating in the union work helped my well-being and mental health a lot of the time. And a lot of the time, it was stressful and hard, and it could be discouraging. So I think there were some days I was in a better place in terms of the mindset I wanted to be as a physician because of my work with the union. And some days I was probably, having a stressful day that had to do with union work, and I wasn't the best, type of physician I want to be. But I think more and more people, more and more physicians agree that there are numerous problems, injustices, inequities with not only our training of physicians, but with our healthcare system and our practice of medicine. And I think a lot of the time we individually or collectively take a position of like, what can you do? It's this huge machine that's just really hard to make any change in. And I think that one reason that resident physician unions are spreading so quickly and so powerfully are that it offers an alternative way to start advocating in a way that feels very powerful. Of course, I feel like, going back to your question, of course, I feel like it made me more fully realized as the physician that I want to be. So yes, I think I was a better physician because of my union work.
Now, when I trained in the 1990s, there were no work duty hour limitations. And when I finished my residency and started as an attending, and then a few years later when I became a program director, I was the program director for a med-peds residency, all of a sudden there was a big discussion nationally that there should be duty hours. And there was actually pressure coming from Congress that the ACGME should set limits, an 80-hour week, and all of the various rules that then subsequently went into effect. And what was striking to me at the time was that program directors and many others within the profession were pushing back. They were the ones who were often concerned about change. And there was this argument that, if we cut from 100 hours a week to 80 hours a week, or if we limit it to 80 hours a week, we're not going to train good physicians. And there was this only half joke among surgeons that the problem with every other night call is that you miss half the cases. So there was this kind of mindset that I saw of sort of, no one said this, but I interpreted it as, I went through it, so you should too. I don't think anyone said that. Everyone would say, to be a good physician, you can't just work 80 hours a week. You have to be there to see your patients through the whole process. And at the time, I thought it was ridiculous, but I have to say that was a very pervasive view. And it was odd to me because ordinarily when you think about improving the work environment, you would think that those who have gone through it themselves would be advocates for change, but often they weren't. And I'm curious which is why to some extent it had to be imposed externally. And so I'm curious to what extent you see that mindset of, you guys you're not going to be well trained. You've got to work long hours. You're not showing dedication to your patients. You're putting yourselves first, et cetera, et cetera. To what extent do you still see that mindset, or has that passed?
Yeah, a lot to chew on there. Just to directly answer your question, it's still pervasive. It is very quickly internalized by many young trainees. And it oftentimes, in terms of, organizing people and encouraging people, it kind of limits their thinking about what even is possible or what we can do or what we can change. But I think it's everywhere. It's hard to know where to to go from that simple answer, but just marinating with your question, I think there is a legitimate question about what is required to train physicians adequately, especially within each specialty. I think there's a lot of that. I went through it, and so you have to as well, and this generation is weaker and they're worse physicians. That opens up a total can of worms and discussion about so many things. I think it's very hard to defend that the way things are right now is healthy, that it is producing quality physicians who are well. I think it's impossible to defend. I think it's sad that it has to be so obviously, like, why would you want your own trainees to go through that you already went through? Even if things were worse a couple of decades ago, that is not an argument that things should not be better now, or that things aren't going well now, or that physicians in training that they should tolerate mistreatment, exploitation. That is certainly not an argument. It's certainly not an argument that should come from, I think, people who are in leadership positions in the training process, who are overseeing the mentorship and training and education of medical students and residents and fellows. I think that attitude just frankly doesn't belong in academic medicine. And I think that there is growth and slow change about that, agreement about that. But I think we still have a very long ways to go. I think all the evidence that has been gathered just shows how unwell physicians are, and begs for a conversation about how to work on things, how to change things.
Yeah, now the American Medical Association has been organized medicine, quote unquote, for many, many years, for many decades, and has been advocating for physicians writ large, for physicians across the United States. And unfortunately, it has a rather checkered past. If you look at the history of the American Medical Association, it's often been on the wrong side of history. It fought Medicare, it fought Medicaid. It has repeatedly fought attempts to create better healthcare coverage for patients. If you go all the way back to President Roosevelt, you've seen, and then President Truman, you see this long history of the AMA advocating for physicians, in some cases in ways that were probably harmful to patients. And I guess my question to you is, how can resident unions make sure that they are ultimately making care better for patients as well as life better for residents?
Well, when you form and join and participate in a resident union, you short circuit all of that history and tradition and hierarchy and leadership that isn't aligned with what maybe many in this generation of physicians wants to advocate for or thinks is acceptable. Immediately, you don't have to. I mean, some people might argue, why don't some of you join AMA and work your way up the ranks and advocate? That's the lobby in place. That's the organization in place. And I wouldn't tell anybody not to do that, participate in that, if they see that as an avenue to advocate or make a difference or make change. In fact, I think that I was reading an article about how there was a vote on universal single payer healthcare within the AMA body that was forced by a group of young physicians within the AMA, if I'm not mistaken, and how that was a giant shift in the conversation. The AMA still does not explicitly advocate for universal single payer, the only way to guarantee healthcare for everybody in the United States. And I think that it's valid if you want to try to work your way into and through an organization and try to change that organization's values and tactics and advocacy to make it more patient-centered, justice-centered, equity-centered. I think the criticisms you just made of the AMA are criticisms that I hold and that many of my colleagues in union leadership and many physicians in my generation hold. And in that light, there's little surprise why folks like me would look for alternative ways to advocate, to not have to be conflicting with others about issues that we maybe feel should not be a topic of conversation. Physicians in the United States, I think, are second highest paid in the world behind Liechtenstein. So, good job. We did it. We advocated for ourselves. Okay, we're there. resident unions, again, it's immediate. It's an immediate direct voice. It's independent. They can pursue whatever they want to pursue in terms of advocacy without any ties, without any restrictions, without any, great, we've heard your voice. Thank you for your input. Unfortunately, we just can't do that right now for these reasons, or there's not the money there, or this is complex for that reason politically, or whatever it is. I think many other organizations, there's just so much of that own internal hurdles or conflict or baggage that you start wading into. Having a union right now, you're just totally unfettered. It's just you and your colleagues and your co-residents and fellows advocating for what you think should be advocated for right now.
Well, thank you, Brandon. You've been very helpful in terms of giving us a snapshot of some of the key issues that you've had to address and think about in the role you played as a leader at your institution. And I think I think the story is still developing. It's going to take time to figure out what contributions unions can make within residency training in terms of helping residents live more healthy lives professionally and personally, which I think is something that we all agree is going to be critical for the well-being of future physicians and hopefully for their patients as well. So thanks for sharing.
Thank you so much for having me, Saul.
We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Take care, everyone.